3 words were enough to erase a $300 million smile. In the heart of Manhattan, inside an upscale restaurant where glass chandeliers reflected wealth like liquid light, Ava Johnson moved quietly between tables, just another waitress no one truly noticed. Plates were polished, voices were soft, and deals worth fortunes were being spoken in low, confident tones. At the center of it all sat Richard Bennett, a billionaire known for controlling outcomes before they even began. Tonight, he looked untouchable, relaxed in a tailored suit, surrounded by advisors as he prepared to finalize the Blackridge project, a $300 million investment that would define his year. He smiled like a man who had already won. But just a few feet away, something shifted. Ava stepped near a neighboring table to clear glasses, her movements practiced and invisible, when fragments of conversation cut through the background noise. Blackridge, internal leak, confirm it. The words were repeated, careful, and deliberate, like signals rather than speech. Ava slowed without realizing it, her eyes subtly tracking the group speaking just out of direct attention. One man leaned closer to his phone, screen tilted away from view. Another tapped a folder twice before sliding it under a napkin, too casually, too intentionally. Ava had spent years learning how to disappear in plain sight, but she had also learned something else. People only hide what they fear losing. Across the room, Richard Bennett laughed softly at something his advisor said, completely unaware that the foundation of his biggest deal might already be cracking. Ava's gaze flicked back to the neighboring table. The phrase came again, quieter this time, almost like a warning being tested. Blackridge internal leak. Something about it didn't belong in a casual conversation. Carried weight, urgency, control. Ava felt a small shift in the air, the kind that comes before a storm no one else has noticed yet. She wasn't part of their world. Not the billionaires, not the executives, not the power players who decided outcomes with signatures and silence. But she could hear them, and sometimes hearing was enough to change everything. Richard Bennett lifted his glass, still smiling, still certain, unaware that across the room, a waitress had just heard the first crack in his empire. And for the first time that night, Ava Johnson didn't look away. Ava Johnson continued moving through the restaurant as if nothing had changed, but the words she had heard refused to fade. Blackridge internal leak. The phrase repeated in her mind like a quiet alarm no one else could hear. She placed a glass down at a nearby table with steady hands, yet her attention kept drifting back to the group of executives, speaking in lowered voices, just beyond the edge of the dining area. Their behavior was too controlled, too precise, like every gesture had been rehearsed in advance. One of them checked his watch every few seconds, another kept adjusting a folder that never stayed open for long, and the third leaned in only when the others stopped speaking. Ava had worked long enough in high-end restaurants to understand patterns, and this one did not belong to casual business conversation. Across the room, Richard Bennett remained focused on his own table, confident and calm, discussing projections for the Blackridge project with the kind of certainty that came from years of winning. He nodded occasionally, smiling slightly as one of his advisors explained final figures on a tablet. $300 million was not just a number in this room, it was momentum, reputation, and control. Yet just a few steps away, Ava felt a different kind of momentum building, one that no one else seemed willing to notice. As she returned to the service station, she replayed what she had seen and heard. The repetition of the words was not accidental. It sounded like confirmation, like something being verified in real time. Ava glanced again toward the neighboring table. One of the men subtly angled his phone downward under the table, thumb moving quickly across the screen before he slipped it back into his jacket. Another briefly opened a document, only to close it again the moment someone passed behind him. The actions were small, but together they formed a picture that felt increasingly deliberate. Ava's instincts told her she was not meant to understand it, yet she already did. Something inside Blackridge was not stable. Something private had already become exposed. She hesitated near the drink station, fingers resting lightly on the edge of a tray, weighing a decision she did not want to make. She was invisible here, and invisibility was safety. But silence had its own consequences. She looked toward Richard Bennett again. He was laughing now, a relaxed expression on his face as he raised his glass slightly in agreement with his advisor. He looked like a man standing at the peak of certainty, completely unaware of the instability forming just outside his awareness. Ava took a slow breath, then stepped forward, moving not toward the executives, but toward a nearby staff member instead. Her voice stayed low, controlled, professional. She said only that there might be an issue with one of the advisors at table 7 and that it would be wise to check quietly. The staff member nodded without question, already moving away, unaware of the weight behind the message. Ava returned to her section immediately, resuming her work as if nothing had happened. Plates were cleared, orders were taken, and conversations flowed around her like nothing beneath the surface had shifted. But Ava knew it had. Across the room, Richard Bennett lifted his hand slightly, signaling for the final agreement documents to be brought over. The moment felt ordinary to everyone watching. Yet Ava's eyes stayed fixed on the movement of the neighboring table, where one man had just gone completely still, staring at his phone without blinking. Something had changed, and in the quiet tension of that elegant room, the first visible crack in a $300 million deal had just begun to form. Ava Johnson moved through the restaurant with steady precision, but her awareness had shifted completely. Every table she passed now felt different, as if the room itself had become divided into two realities, one visible and one hidden just beneath it. On the surface, nothing had changed. Crystal glasses still caught the warm light, conversations still flowed in soft, expensive tones, and Richard Bennett still appeared completely in control at the center of the room. Yet Ava could no longer unsee the pattern forming near the neighboring table. The words she had heard earlier were no longer whispered in isolation. They were being reinforced through behavior, through hesitation, through the subtle fragmentation of trust between the men sitting there. Blackridge internal leak was no longer just a phrase. It was becoming a process unfolding in real time. One of the executives quietly stood up from the table, excusing himself with a tone that felt too neutral, too rehearsed. He walked toward the hallway where the restrooms were located, but instead of continuing forward, he paused briefly near the corner where service staff rarely paid attention. Ava noticed him glance at his phone again, thumb moving quickly before he looked up as if checking whether anyone had seen. Another executive at the table leaned closer to a colleague, their conversation almost completely silent now. Their expressions tightened as if the situation had shifted beyond comfort into urgency. Ava placed a tray down at a nearby station, her movements calm, but her thoughts sharper with each passing second. She understood enough to know that whatever Blackridge represented, it was no longer stable. Something had been exposed, and people were reacting to that exposure in different ways. Some were trying to contain it. Others were preparing to abandon it. Across the room, Richard Bennett raised his hand slightly and the final documents were brought to his table. The moment felt ceremonial, almost celebratory. He signed the first page with smooth confidence, his pen moving without hesitation. His advisor leaned in, speaking softly about final confirmation numbers, while Richard nodded, already anticipating completion. Ava's gaze shifted instinctively back to the neighboring table. One of the executives had now stopped pretending entirely. His phone was held under the table for longer this time, his thumb moving with urgency, his posture rigid. The atmosphere around him had changed from controlled professionalism to something closer to quiet alarm. Ava felt a tightening in her chest, not fear, but clarity. She stepped away from her station and approached a junior staff member near the beverage counter. Her voice remained low and measured as she repeated what she had said earlier, that there might be an issue involving one of the advisors and that management should be alerted discreetly. The staff member hesitated only briefly before nodding and moving away. Ava did not stay to watch the response. She returned to her section immediately, resuming service as if nothing had shifted. But now the shift was irreversible. At table 7, Richard Bennett was sliding the final page forward for signature when his phone vibrated once on the table beside him. He glanced down casually at first, expecting a routine update, but the expression on his face changed almost instantly. The smile he had carried throughout the evening did not disappear dramatically. It faded in a way that was almost imperceptible at first, like light dimming behind glass. His eyes scanned the message once, then again, slower this time. Across the room, Ava continued clearing glasses with calm efficiency, but she did not need to look to know what had just happened. The energy in the room had shifted. Conversations at nearby tables softened. The executives at the neighboring table were no longer speaking at all. And for the first time that evening, Richard Bennett did not look like a man who controlled the room. He looked like someone who had just realized the room had been controlling him all along. The message on Richard Bennett's phone did not contain many words, but it carried enough weight to change the entire atmosphere of the room. His eyes stayed fixed on the screen longer than usual, the confidence that had defined his posture slowly giving way to something more restrained, more careful. Around him, the quiet celebration of the Blackridge signing began to fracture. His advisor leaned in, noticing the shift, asking a question in a low voice, but Richard did not respond immediately. For the first time that evening, he was no longer leading the moment. He was reacting to it. Ava Johnson noticed the change without needing to look directly. She had already returned to her section, placing clean glasses and adjusting table settings with the same calm rhythm she always used, but her attention was fully divided now. The neighboring executives were no longer pretending to relax. One of them had stopped speaking entirely, his chair slightly pulled back, his body angled as if preparing to leave without drawing attention. Another kept glancing toward Richard's table, his expression tightening with each passing second. The words Ava had heard earlier were no longer just fragments of a conversation. They had become a reality unfolding across the room. Blackridge's internal leak was no longer a warning. It was confirmation. Richard finally set his phone down, but the movement lacked its earlier confidence. The smile that had defined him earlier in the evening was gone, replaced by a neutral expression that felt carefully constructed. He spoke briefly to his advisor, his voice lower now, more controlled, and the advisor immediately straightened, scanning the room as if reassessing everything he thought he understood. At the neighboring table, one of the executives stood up abruptly, excusing himself with a tone that did not match the urgency in his movements. He walked toward the exit, but not before pausing near the side corridor, checking his phone once more as if confirming instructions. Ava watched this without staring, her movements still steady as she cleared another table. She understood now that something had already moved beyond prevention. Information had escaped its intended boundaries, and every person involved was adjusting their position accordingly. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze shifting across the room for the first time without purpose. It was not the gaze of a man observing his environment. It was the gaze of someone recalculating it. The documents on the table remained unsigned for a brief moment, untouched, waiting. The Blackridge deal, once a clean line from intention to execution, now felt suspended in uncertainty. Ava placed a tray down at the service station and glanced once more toward the center of the room. Richard was no longer smiling at all. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. The control that had defined his presence had not shattered loudly. It had simply dissolved, replaced by silence and calculation. And in that silence, the entire room felt different, as if the balance of power had shifted without anyone announcing it. Ava returned to her work, but she no longer felt invisible in the same way. For the first time that evening, invisibility felt less like safety and more like awareness. Something had changed at table 7, something irreversible, and Richard Bennett now understood what Ava had known moments earlier. A single unseen fracture had already begun to spread. The silence around table 7 deepened in a way that felt heavier than conversation. Richard Bennett remained seated, but his posture had shifted again, no longer relaxed, no longer fully present in the celebratory rhythm that had defined him earlier. The phone on the table had gone dark, yet its impact lingered in the air like a signal that could not be undone. His advisor spoke softly, carefully choosing words that no longer carried certainty, only caution. Richard listened without interrupting, his eyes no longer focused on the documents in front of him, but on something beyond them, something unfolding outside the boundaries of the room. Ava Johnson continued her work through the shift in atmosphere, collecting empty glasses and resetting tables with practiced efficiency. Yet every movement now felt connected to the tension spreading across the dining floor. She did not need to hear the full conversation to understand that whatever had been confirmed on that screen was escalating in real time. The neighboring executives were no longer seated in alignment. One had fully stood, coat now on his arm, scanning the room once as if measuring exit timing. Another leaned in, whispering urgently into a phone that was no longer hidden. The last remained seated, but his hands were still, placed flat on the table, as if grounding himself against the situation unfolding around him. Ava noticed these details without stopping her work, her mind assembling them into a clearer picture than any spoken explanation could provide. The Blackridge project was no longer stable. It was moving, breaking, reshaping itself under pressure that had just been revealed. Across the room, Richard finally broke his silence. He spoke a few words to his advisor, and the advisor immediately straightened, pulling out a second device, scrolling quickly as if trying to verify something that had just changed. The calm structure of the evening was dissolving into layers of private recalculations. Ava passed near the service station and briefly glanced toward table 7 again. Richard had not reopened the documents. Instead, he was reading something new, a message or report that required more attention than anything before it. His expression remained controlled, but the control was now intentional rather than natural, like a man actively holding together a system that no longer responded to assumption. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted subtly as other guests began to sense the change. Conversations softened, glances moved more frequently toward the center of the room, and even the staff began adjusting their pace without understanding why. Ava placed a tray down and paused for half a second longer than usual, noticing how the energy had transitioned from celebration to containment. Something had been triggered, and now everyone was reacting in different layers of awareness. Richard finally closed the message and looked up, scanning the room in a way he had not done before. It was no longer the gaze of ownership. It was the gaze of assessment. The Blackridge deal, once presented as inevitable, now existed in a fragile state between continuation and collapse. Ava returned to her section, her expression unchanged, but her awareness sharpened further. She understood now that the most important moments were not the ones that made noise, but the ones that changed direction silently. And in that silence, Richard Bennett was beginning to realize that what had just been exposed was not only a leak, but a shift in control he could no longer ignore. The shift in Richard Bennett's expression was no longer subtle. It had settled into something colder, more deliberate, as if he was no longer reacting to a problem but beginning to map its structure. Around him, the restaurant felt quieter even though no one had stopped speaking completely. Conversations continued, glasses were lifted, and plates were served, but the energy had changed in a way that could not be reversed. Ava Johnson felt it as she moved between tables, her steps steady, her attention divided between her duties and the unfolding tension at the center of the room. At table 7, Richard finally spoke in a low voice that no longer carried confidence but control under pressure. His advisor leaned in immediately, listening with heightened focus, then responded with urgency that had not been present earlier in the evening. A second phone was brought out, then a third device appeared on the table, each one representing a different layer of communication. The Blackridge deal was no longer a single transaction. It had become a network of reactions. Ava passed near the service station and caught fragments of movement from the neighboring executives. One was now fully standing, no longer pretending to remain engaged. He adjusted his jacket once, then twice, as if preparing to leave but waiting for permission from a situation that no longer offered certainty. Another executive remained seated but was no longer part of the conversation at the table. His attention was entirely on his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be updates arriving in rapid succession. The third had shifted his chair slightly away from the table, creating distance not just physically but symbolically, as if separating himself from the consequences forming in real time. Richard's gaze dropped again to the documents in front of him, but he did not touch them. Instead, he tapped once on the table, a small controlled motion that carried more meaning than words. His advisor nodded and immediately stepped away, walking toward a quieter corner of the restaurant to make a call. The transformation in the room was no longer confined to table 7. Other guests were beginning to notice the change. A few conversations slowed, then paused briefly before resuming with less certainty. Even the staff moved differently, less fluidly, as if sensing that something unseen had altered the rhythm of the evening. Ava stopped, for a moment near the beverage station, observing without drawing attention. She saw Richard glance around the room again, not as a host of the moment, but as someone recalibrating his understanding of it. His jaw tightened slightly, then relaxed, a controlled cycle of containment. Whatever had been confirmed earlier was now expanding into consequences that required immediate adjustment. A final message appeared on his primary phone, and this time Richard did not hide his reaction. His eyes narrowed slightly, then softened into a neutral expression that was more difficult to read than any emotion before it. The Blackridge project was no longer something he was about to complete. It was something he was now actively managing in real time. Ava resumed her work, but her awareness remained sharp. She understood now that the most dangerous moments in any room like this were not the loud disruptions, but the quiet recalculations happening behind calm faces. Richard Bennett was no longer preparing to close a deal. He was preparing to contain what was slipping away from it, and the room, without anyone speaking it aloud, had already begun to follow his uncertainty. The change in atmosphere became undeniable when Richard Bennett received another message, this time longer, more detailed, and far less reversible than anything that had come before it. His eyes moved across the screen slowly, not with surprise anymore, but with a measured stillness that suggested acceptance of information he could no longer prevent. Around him, the Blackridge documents remained open, untouched, as if they belonged to a version of the evening that no longer existed. His advisor stood close, waiting for instruction, but for the first time, there were no immediate instructions to give. Ava Johnson continued moving through the dining room, but her awareness had narrowed entirely to the center of the room where decisions were no longer being made, only assessed. At the neighboring table, the final executive who had remained seated finally closed his folder completely. The sound of it was subtle, almost soft, but it carried a sense of completion that did not belong to celebration. He pushed his chair back slowly and stood, adjusting his jacket once before stepping away without looking back. There was no urgency in his movement, only resolution, as if his role in the situation had already concluded somewhere earlier in time. Richard noticed the motion without reacting outwardly. Instead, he placed his phone face down on the table, a gesture that removed digital input from the equation entirely. He looked at his advisor and spoke briefly, his voice low and controlled, but no longer anchored in confidence. The advisor nodded once, then stepped away immediately, moving toward a private corridor to make a call that would not return with reassurance. Ava passed near table 7 again, carrying a tray of glasses that no longer felt connected to the original rhythm of the evening. The energy in the room had shifted from anticipation to fragmentation. Conversations had become inconsistent, breaking and reforming in uneven patterns. Guests who had been present earlier now seemed slightly distant, as if the room itself had widened in perception. Richard remained seated, but his focus had shifted inward. He was no longer observing the room as an environment of control. He was processing it as an environment of consequence. A final notification appeared on his phone, and this time he did not open it immediately. Instead, he stared at it for a long moment, then lifted his gaze toward the restaurant floor. For the first time that evening, he was not looking at the deal or the documents or the people around him. He was looking at the structure of everything at once. Ava stopped briefly near the service station, sensing that something final was unfolding. The Blackridge project, once framed as a controlled transaction, now existed as a series of disconnected outcomes. Whatever had been hidden was no longer contained within private communication. It had moved outward into action. Richard finally picked up his phone again, read the message fully, then set it down with deliberate calm. There was no visible reaction this time, only a quiet acknowledgement that the situation had crossed a threshold. The advisor returned but did not speak immediately. Instead, he waited, standing slightly behind Richard, as if recognizing that the hierarchy of decision had temporarily dissolved. Ava resumed her work, but her attention remained fixed on the center of the room. She understood now that the most important moment was not the signing or the announcement, but the silence that followed when control no longer responded to intention. Richard Bennett sat still for a final moment, then closed the folder in front of him without signing it. The sound of it marked the end of something irreversible, and in that instant, the room fully understood what Ava had sensed from the beginning, that the $300 million smile had not simply disappeared, it had been replaced by the quiet realization that nothing in the room belonged to certainty anymore. The moment the Blackridge folder was closed without a signature, the entire room seemed to understand that nothing about the evening would continue as planned. Richard Bennett remained seated, but his presence no longer anchored the space in the way it had at the beginning. The authority that once shaped conversations around him had shifted into something more restrained, more observational. He was no longer the center of execution. He had become the center of assessment. Ava Johnson moved through the dining floor with quiet precision, but her awareness was now fully locked on table 7. Every gesture there carried meaning that no longer needed explanation. The advisor stood slightly behind Richard, no longer speaking, only waiting. The silence between them was not empty. It was structured, as if decisions were being made in places no longer visible. Around them, the restaurant continued to function, yet the rhythm had changed. Conversations were softer, movements more careful, and even the sound of glass on table felt subdued. Ava noticed how people who had been confident earlier were now recalibrating their behavior, subtly adjusting posture, tone, and distance as if the room itself had issued an unspoken warning. At table 7, Richard finally leaned forward and spoke again, but this time his voice carried no trace of momentum. It was controlled, deliberate, and measured, as if each word had to pass through layers of internal verification before being released. His advisor responded immediately, then stopped mid-sentence, reconsidering, and choosing different phrasing. That single hesitation revealed more than any full explanation could have. Ava placed a tray down and paused briefly, observing how the Blackridge matter had transformed from a transaction into a containment problem. No one was celebrating, no one was negotiating, and no one was arguing. Everything had shifted into management mode, where outcomes were no longer shaped but absorbed. Richard looked down at the closed folder again, then pushed it slightly forward on the table without touching it further. The gesture was small, but it marked separation. The deal was no longer something he was holding. It was something he was distancing himself from. The advisor stepped away again, this time faster, moving toward a quieter section of the restaurant where phone calls could be made without interruption. Ava resumed walking, but her attention remained fully engaged. She had seen enough to understand that the real moment of collapse was not loud or dramatic. It was procedural. It was a series of quiet withdrawals, each one removing a layer of certainty. The neighboring executives had now fully dispersed. The table that had once carried coordinated control was emptying in stages, leaving behind only traces of what had been planned. Richard remained seated alone for a brief moment, his gaze no longer fixed on any document or device. He was simply observing the room, but not as a participant. It was the look of someone recalculating position after recognizing that the environment had already changed without permission. Ava stopped near the service station and allowed herself a brief pause, just long enough to see the final shift. Richard picked up the folder again, not to reopen it, but to close it properly, aligning the edges with careful precision before setting it aside completely. There was no announcement, no reaction, no visible collapse, only resolution, and in that resolution, the meaning of the entire evening became clear. The Blackridge project had not failed in a single moment. It had dissolved step by step, in silence, until nothing remained that could hold it together. And in the center of that silence, Richard Bennett finally understood that control was never lost in chaos, but in quiet moments where no one was watching closely enough to stop it. The final moments inside the restaurant did not arrive with noise or spectacle, but with a quiet finality that settled over the room like a change in temperature. Richard Bennett remained seated for several seconds after the Blackridge folder, had been fully closed and set aside. His hands rested lightly on the table, no longer interacting with any document or device, as if acknowledging that the phase of execution had ended and only aftermath remained. Around him, the atmosphere had fully transitioned from anticipation to completion. Conversations resumed in distant corners of the room, but none of them carried the energy they had earlier in the evening. Everything now felt separated from the center that had once drawn attention effortlessly. Ava Johnson moved through the dining floor with steady professionalism, continuing her work as the shift approached its natural conclusion. Yet her awareness remained anchored to table 7. Richard finally stood, not abruptly, but with a controlled motion that suggested acceptance rather than reaction. His advisor followed immediately, retrieving the remaining materials without speaking, their interaction reduced to brief, efficient gestures. There was no discussion of resolution, no attempt to reframe what had happened. The Blackridge deal no longer existed as a forward-moving event. It existed only as a completed failure of alignment. Richard adjusted his jacket once, then looked across the room without focusing on anything specific. It was not the gaze of a man searching for answers, but of someone reviewing the absence of them. He spoke a few final words to his advisor, and the response was immediate but subdued, confirming what had already been understood without needing to be said aloud. Ava paused briefly near the service station, observing the final shift in presence. The executives who had once surrounded table 7 were gone. The space they occupied now felt neutral, emptied not just physically but structurally, as if the coordination that had defined them earlier had been dissolved at its source. Richard turned slightly toward the exit, but before moving, he stopped for a brief moment. His attention drifted across the room once more, not searching for control, but recognizing its absence. Ava continued working, placing items in their proper positions, maintaining the rhythm of service that no longer depended on the events that had unfolded. Yet something in the room had permanently changed. The energy that once centered on confidence and expectation had been replaced by a quieter understanding of fragility. Richard Bennett finally walked toward the exit, followed by his advisor, both moving without urgency, without conversation, and without the certainty that had defined their arrival. As they left the dining area, no one announced the end of anything, yet the conclusion was unmistakable. Ava watched briefly as the doors closed behind them, then returned to her work. The restaurant continued to function, but the meaning of the evening had already settled into something irreversible. What had begun with a $300 million confidence had ended in silence, and in that silence, Ava Johnson remained exactly where she had always been, unnoticed, steady, and aware of everything that had truly changed without anyone ever seeing it happen.